it's sort of, it's interesting in a lot of ways, having sat around as long as I've sat around in doing this housing, that, when I was in college in the 60s, late 60s, early 70s, I went to college in Maine, and land trusts were actually the new exciting thing, and it's one of the things that I remember working on when I was in college and meeting with people who were creating land trusts to build affordable housing on, and going up to Bangor, I think it was, and working on a sort of model housing development where, just actually physically building houses and stuff. And it's it's a concept that's been around a long time, and it comes up from time to time. I know that, a number of years later, when we started doing, lots of housing, sort of the TIL programs were starting and things like that in the city, and we were looking at lots of housing and figuring out how to keep it affordable for the long term. The idea of land trusts came up again, and there were some groups who eventually created some small land trusts, Lower East Side and tried elsewhere in New York, but we were persuaded that it wasn't necessarily a easy or good idea in New York, one, because it just added complexity to what was already a complex process, and something that nobody in the city or legal world would understand. And if you were trying to preserve the housing, just put regulatory agreements on it for 30 years and you're fine. And having a 30-year horizon or 15 or 20-year horizon was sort of fine, unless you outlive them and you begin to see what happens at the end of those periods with a lot of housing where the use restrictions are wearing out. So I mean, the idea comes back, and this happens in a lot of planning processes. So there's a lot of experience and information out there in the world, and a lot of generations of land trusts. I worked on community gardens even longer, and similarly, that it's sort of, urban farming is all brand new, but I remember when we were building urban farms in the Bronx in the early 70s. So there's a lot of concepts that come around again. So I think it's important, one, to look back, but on the other hand, not be, because when we started doing co-ops, we used to go and talk to the people who built Grand Street and the amalgamated co-ops and all the co-ops starting in the 30s, and they would tell us things and we wouldn't listen. We learned some of those lessons, and some of those weren't true. But so it's both important to I think go out and find those and see what you can learn from them, but not be dissuaded, because things are different and things do change and so forth. So anyways, so land trusts is something that we've known about for a long time, but it's not something that we really we're interested in doing and wanting to do. And we had some of our own experience, similar experience with mutual housing, and we had worked to create a mutual housing association many years ago here at UHAB with our buildings, in order to provide them with a larger level of economic efficiency and opportunity for political kinds of efficiency, sort of the just sort of the things you can get by having large numbers of buildings. And we created an organization called Self-Help Works, and it had a board made up of co-op leaders and so forth, and we staffed it, and we tried to get it to run and operate and sort of have an independent voice for the co-ops for a number of years. But more and more, we began to realize that our co-op leaders were extremely busy. They work 2 jobs or whatever they do just to support their families, and then they're running their buildings, and to get them to come down here or time and take on this extra burden just didn't seem to provide enough benefit to them for that purpose, because, you know, we'd always, in a way, represented the buildings. Many of us lived in the buildings when that was permissible. And so so that one of the issues that comes up around it, one of the lessons learned that we have, and one of our reluctances, is that we ask a lot of our co-op leaders, and then to ask more of them is a little bit, seemed to be a little bit beyond what we could do. On the other hand, we helped organize some other groups that formed out of co-ops, but they were more neighborhood based, and we had done a lot of organizing on a neighborhood basis to get co-ops to join together, to do buying clubs, to do, you know, food co-ops, to, you know, after school programs for kids and stuff, and some of those took off for a while, and then they would not. But one of the things that buildings liked on the local level was to be able to, and I think it sort of speaks possibly to some of what might be the benefits of what might happen in East Harlem, is they liked meeting with each other. When we used to do a lot of training and we brought lots of separate buildings together to do training, buildings love to come together, building leaders love to just complain about their you know, problems and stuff, and get together and hear what other buildings are doing and exchange information and stuff like that. So that, and then we've taken on a number of fights with groups of buildings and this kind of organizing help. One was, at one point, the city was no longer going to sell buildings for the $250 that they were selling them. They were going to sell them for market rates, depending upon what neighborhood they were, and all the buildings came together and rose up. And they've also, a number of times when the programs, the TIL program, particularly were on the chopping block, they really rose up and stood up and defended the programs that they found dear. So that organizing was good. And then there was a gentleman, Jordi Reyes Montblanc, who died not that long ago, who organized sort of Hamilton Heights, Washington Heights, West Harlem, a coalition, HDFC coalition, and they took on water and sewer taxes as a primary issue, and they were organized for a number of years. But it was really the creation of the leadership of one guy and a few trusted followers, and he, you know, got very involved with larger co-op organizations citywide and nationally, and really was able to, you know, sort of get HDFC co-ops support and larger name in that way. But so anyways, so that the notion of organizing co-ops and having a larger body to do things has always been something that makes sense, but it's on a practical level, it's always, you know, where do you find the energy amongst the leadership of those buildings? You know, we had always thought that it might, in some ways it would be a good idea if you could get building leaders to move up and out of their buildings so that new leadership could emerge. But it's a task that eluded us. But you know, so there are some things, but maybe closer to home, those kinds of things might make sense. And I think it speaks to, you know, the folks that you're dealing with in East Harlem are talking about organizing the buildings that are in trouble, but in fact it may be the exact opposite, which is they may not become owned by the land trusts, but they may in fact like and support the notion of having a neighborhood sort of scale organization that they could meet each other and maybe do some serving of their own interests and stuff through, may be another purpose for that kind of organizing. So we got to this in part because it's a concept whose interests came around again. It was sort of, on the rise in terms of something that we might do. And Anya's predecessor, Anya's our attorney who does our co-oping, was sort of interested in it, and we had 2 projects in our pipeline that were multi-building co-ops. One was in Hamilton Heights. We have 12 buildings, all within a couple blocks of each other, many of them on the same streets. And then we have these 18 buildings out in Ridgewood Bushwick. And so the Hamilton Heights buildings, we wanted to create what we call community co-op, which is just one large co-op spread across the neighborhood. And we struggled for a number of years with the Attorney General's office about their willingness to let us have multi-building co-ops that weren't sort of one contiguous set of buildings. And so we kept pushing, there was some lawsuit many years ago about 2 buildings that became one co-op, but one was sort of a high-rise, one was a little building, and they're fixed up differently, they were built to different standard, all sorts of things were different than our case, but anyways, they kept resisting. Finally, we did get them to agree to let us do the one in Hamilton Heights. It's just a straight co-op. But after they did it, they said, we'll never let you do it again. You're not supposed to ever tell anybody that you did it. And then next time you do it, you're gonna have to build them on a land trust. And the person who was running the office then was our former attorney, who went over to the Attorney General's office, and she had this idea that we should do these as land trusts anyway. So, and
what was her reasoning?
well, it took a while to finally understand what the reasoning was, and particularly when you think about Ridgewood Bushwick, where there's just a lot of these smaller permanent buildings that are owned by smaller landlords and larger landlords, and they're just out there. And they were afraid of a private owner who owned a multiple number of buildings saying, I want to do a co-op. And being able to do a co-op, being able to sell the minimum number of apartments, and then control these things and sort of be out and be able to sell them off when they wanted, and just sort of get all their buildings under this ownership entity and just maintain control of them because they'd own 85% of them, sell them units when they wanted, control the rest of it, and not be so subject to rent stabilization, all the rest of the things that they may or may not be exempt from. So there was this fear that it was ripe for abuse. If they let us do it, then others might be able to do it. So that if you're required to put it on top of a nonprofit land trust who has these nonprofit purposes, then it makes it. So that's why we are, I don't think we would have done it necessarily if we could have just done what we call a community co-op, which is a single entity owner cooperative of all of these buildings. But that being said, the longevity and the permanence of the regulatory control, because the land is owned, or whatever is owned by the land trust, is permanent, and it doesn't expire like a regulatory agreement, as well as in some ways some of the other kinds of regulatory controls that the land trust might have on buildings that are in trouble or wanting to go off on their own and do things contrary to what the intent was. It could be an added benefit for these buildings, but then again, where are you going to find the leadership and so forth for this land trust? Particularly in this case, although doesn't necessarily have to be that way, but that's how it will start out. If it's not a land trust that has this notion that it will grow. One of the things about mutual housing associations and I think land trust is that very often their membership, their boards are made up of existing residents, future residents, and community interests. And it is the community interest in future residents that give it an ongoing vitality, because they have the notion of having future projects. They will raise money, they will do these things. The people who are there have a very different interest, and that's just leave me alone and let us run our co-op or live in our house. You know, why are you bothering me? Why, you know, it's not that they don't appreciate what it is, but they often are busy with what they're doing and having achieved, you know, what they wanted for housing after long effort, and still have to run it. They don't have as much interest on new projects and so forth. So that, you know, there is the financing of these things, there is all, you know, the structure, all of it. But in fact, if I had to say what is the most difficult part of both developing a co-op and developing something more complex, which would be home ownership, maybe co-ops on a land trust, or maybe a variety of home ownership kinds of entity on a land trust, it is the people part. It's the people design. It's figuring out, you know, how are you going to build in the incentives to have a organization that doesn't just disappear, that people just stop meeting. What's the point? We're already meeting as a co-op. Why do we have to meet as a land trust? You know, that's one of our concerns. That's, you know, on the Lower East Side, there is the Rain Land Trust that has 9, I believe, HDFC co-ops that are on it. It was created in the 80s by...
Doesn't exist anymore though, right?
It does exist. Well, it's a problem. The buildings all exist. They're all there. One of the building leaders works here. And but they stopped meeting as a land trust, and they stopped filing with the state, and all of a sudden their corporation was dissolved. But then they had an issue where building had to borrow money, or they had to get a tax abatement or something, and you needed the corporate entity to sign something. But there was no corporate entity, you know, so they had to reconstitute it. It's not like you can't get it back. It's gone forever. It's just you got to then file all your stuff going back all the years. You got to get everybody to show up and have an election. You know, you got to do all this stuff. But there was no point in having these meetings annually when they were busy running their buildings. And so that, you know, something is going to dwindle. On the other hand, if the land trust is managing the buildings and doing everything, then all of a sudden the co-op corporations why should we meet as a co-op? You've got this balance of, you know, so what's the point? You know, where's the conservation of energy? Who's gonna provide the extra layer and extra level of work, and the extra, you know, financial statement to the state, and the extra tax filings, and, you know, all the requirements. So that I think is so you know, really sort of what's the point? You know, what we did when we dissolved our mutual housing association was we made UHAB into a membership organization. So now, you know, 650, 700 co-ops are members of UHAB, and some of our services we provide to co-ops have to be to a group by law. Insurance, you can't have a group insurance policy without having a group that has a purpose larger than just getting a good price on insurance. And so our membership satisfied that. That's what Self-Help Works, our mutual housing association, one of its purposes is, you know, we have all these buildings that are nominally members. They pay membership dues. It helps support a small staff that provides services. You know, we have our online bookkeeping and our straight bookkeeping services. We have fuel purchasing services. We have ongoing seminars. We do, you know, energy conservation kinds of stuff, and all sorts of services through the year.
A handful of people in a building with 30 units, you know, and then another handful of people perhaps a few blocks away. And so what you're, you know, and no matter what we can come up with from the financing end, if you don't have the people power.
Right. Yeah, I mean, we have a whole staff that works with the HDFCs, particularly the troubled HDFCs, and it is a multi-year undertaking to get a building that's in trouble, out of trouble and back into health. And a lot of it depends upon what the city's willing to make available, and sort of the status of the various laws and stuff that allow you to do that. It's not sort of a magic trick that you can just do. It's not even financing, although financing is going to be a problem. And one of the things that, in fact, land trusts will do is they'll make financing more difficult, not less difficult. Not that that's a terrible thing, but a bank isn't going to know what to do when it only has the building and not the land. Across the country, homeowners who want to get a mortgage on their land trust house have trouble getting a regular conventional homeowner's mortgage because it's not conventional, because a land trust owns the land and they're on leased land. It's not like it's unusual. Half of Wall Street is leased. Large parts of the land under Wall Street are owned by that little church with a steeple at the end of the street, because the king gave it to them back before there was a United States. But so that, banks know how to do this, and they've been doing it for a couple hundred years down here on Wall Street, but they do it in Honolulu, where the Queen owns most of the land under Honolulu, but like in England too, I guess the Queen in England.
You guys work with HPD quite a bit.
Yeah.
And so then a lot of the work you do with the buildings and with these groups of buildings ends up having to be negotiated with HPD, and you said even the Attorney General's office in some cases.
Right.
Can you describe what openness HPD has to these types of projects? As you've recently created a land trust.
Well, we're in the process.
You're in the
of creating
process,
that.
which I'm assuming it's a negotiation with them too, or
One is that the buildings that we're dealing with out in Ridgewood Bushwick were HUD 203K failed buildings. That was a HUD scandal. If you look it up, you can read the article and see limits about the HUD scandal. And it was a program that was designed for nonprofits to be able to write these mortgages and do all sorts of things with. It's supposed to be small homes, smaller buildings. These are slightly larger than what it was. And there are all these fake nonprofits that just sort of bulked up these mortgages and sold them, and eventually they all just collapsed. And when Andrew Cuomo was HUD secretary, one of the last things he did was sort of, the HUD was foreclosing on all these, and he just gave the city money to fix the 203K problems. And so we have a few buildings up in East Harlem, actually, that will be little co-ops. And then we have these 18 buildings that had organized and wanted to be co-ops, and came to us and wanted to be co-ops. And so we, for political reasons, partnered with Ridgewood Bushwick Senior Citizen Association, whatever they're called. And they do the management in the buildings, and we work together on the renovations, and we're doing the co-op conversion. It's all HUD grants, so there's no ticking financing on these, so that we don't have any pressing deadlines there's a lot of other buildings we work with that have a lot more pressing deadlines, so this one's taking a little longer than we would like. And we also then had to figure out how to do the land trust, which will look not much different than the co-op. It'll be incorporated the same way as a HDFC corporation. It will have a board, and its purposes will be to support the co-ops that sit on it, and in that way we can then have the co-op be one co-op, the large group of buildings be one co-op, and manage themselves, which is how they're being managed now, as one large group.
And the advantage of having the land trust under it for this specific context is, again?
The Attorney General will allow us to have a multiple building co-op, and these are more spread out even than the ones in Hamilton Heights.
So this is a stipulation coming down.
Well,
from the government.
we wanted to do a community co-op, and this is the only way that they were comfortable sort of setting a precedent of doing these spread out co-ops.
And so you have access as the sponsor.
We're
The
currently the
CLT.
sponsor, and we jointly, yes, and we jointly own the buildings with Ridgewood Bushwick.
And so when it becomes when we pass the ownership from UHAB to the HDFCs, will UHAB still be the sponsor for the Community Land Trust? Because I know that that's one of the problems with the Rain Co-op, right? Like Catholic Charities was the sponsor for the CLT, and they kind of
Well, it was.
they kind of stepped out or
Well,
became
LESAC, the Lower East Side Catholic Area, Catholic Area Council, or whatever they were, went out of business. They finished they did a lot of buildings, development on the Lower East Side, and then they were done, and they were gone. So they stopped functioning, and which is one of the problems with with having a sponsor and not being an independent group that's self-supporting. So I believe that at least initially we would continue to play a role in the land
CLT.
trust,
Mhm.
just because it's it's not something, it's something new, and we've got to figure out what it is. If indeed we can figure out how to have it take on a life of its own,
Right.
if there is that purpose, then it would be nice to be able to sort of say, well, we don't need to do this anymore.
Step off.
Which is what we do on the co-ops. I mean, when we create the co-ops, 3 of us here are the board. It's just the easiest way to create a co-op, because you have to do background checks on everybody who becomes the board. It just goes on and on, so we can send in the same background check every time they do this. And then once they have the first annual meeting at the co-ops, the 3 of us get to write this letter saying we resign, and it's always fun because they've elected their new board members, they take over, and so forth, and so we're there for the short period between when they actually become a co-op and when they finally get together, have their first annual meeting, the stock certificates get handed out, the lawyers have finished all the work, everything is done. We do that. So this may be a much longer process that the land trust will be there, but the land trust, and maybe we'll figure out that the land trust can be absolutely identical to the community co-op buildings, so that the meetings can be joined, so that as long as the co-op is meeting, the land trust is meeting it. But I don't know. I mean, it's sort of it's a work in progress, and it's something to be discovered, but that's always been our greatest fear, is so who's going to do it, and what are they going to do? And maybe there's an interest, there's more buildings out there, there's more stuff that could be done, there's other co-ops that we certainly work with in that area, and there's buildings in foreclosure that we organize and so forth out there, so who knows, but that's our plan is to create this community co-op and have this nascent.
Will there,
trust.
the boards generally on land trusts will have community members as well as
Right.
residents? Is that the plan for this trust?
I think eventually, if there's a need for it, if there's not a need, but a purpose that, a life to it, if it's purely a technical detail to allow them to be a community co-op, then I mean, we'll be on it, and, there may be some other community folks that would join it, but it may be that we go the other direction and make it identical with the co-op, so that we don't get into the rain problem that they can have. For that, and that may be at some point they may have a purpose. A couple of years later, there may be, a program for land trusts, and therefore they've got a ready-made one and can step into it, or, there may be other opportunities that present themselves that we can help them with.
Have you been able to work with the councilor or the community board with this project, or have they been involved at all?
They've not been involved at all. It's, the politics out in that neighborhood with Vito Lopez have been very, were very difficult in the beginning, and so it's somewhat less so now, but it took a lot to just have a good relationship with them and get this project going and done.
So I think, excuse me, for the purposes of our project, we're really trying to focus on how financially it would work out. And so I'd like to get some of your perspective on maybe some of the costs that we should be considering, where we should be looking to get an idea of like estimates, whether it be for rents or management, and even how like these different management entities within the different buildings play into, or how that translates into some sort of cost that we should be taking into consideration when we present them with these different options. If that makes sense.
In a way, but I mean, the costs of developing buildings, a new building, are pretty straightforward. You know what I mean? And a lot of it just has to do with the construction cost. It all gets built from the construction cost. And the thing that Ken Ray did, you've seen his financial plan. Those numbers are sort of, they're standard numbers. There's accepted operating costs that you project for a building to have. There's construction costs, which are relatively standard, except they become individualized if you're rehabbing a building for the condition of the building, or you're building a new building, is it on top of a subway, or is it, whatever. So I don't know whether that's meaningful in a way. I think the things that need to be addressed are the special things that a land trust brings to a project in terms of cost. And one of them that potentially makes sense in a place like East Harlem is that a lot of the buildings are smaller in East Harlem, and small buildings are inefficient to manage for outside managers. Most of our smaller buildings, I think in East Harlem and around the city, most of our buildings, 80% or more of the HCFCs manage themselves, so that's in a way an advantage. The smaller buildings, they're some ways simpler, although there's some economies of scale that sometimes make them more difficult, and personalities can loom large in smaller buildings. But if they were to be managed by outside managers, then that's a role that a land trust clearly could do and could. It's one of the reasons why we like doing community co-ops, partly because the projects were put together that way, but also in the end, it's the only way you can manage. And these days the city is for whatever reasons, is mandating outside management. That when you do a project with them, they don't let buildings self-manage. There's no bearing in fact. I would say that the self-managers, Charlotte can disagree if she wants, she sees the buildings more often daily, but do as good a job or better job than most managers. I don't think there's anything that says managers are better, professional managers
We've
are
seen
better.
buildings have a lot of problems with outside managers.
Right, they pay themselves and they don't pay the bills.
Yeah.
Right.
Whereas, the inside managers sometimes pay themselves and don't pay the bills, but more often than not, when buildings get in trouble, they pay the correct bills, the ones that keep the heat on and the building functioning for the people, and they choose to pay the bills that mean less to them, like taxes and water and sewer and some of that, which is a perfectly good choice for residents, because in fact, doing the opposite means that the building is deteriorating faster than you can fix it, which is what we see in all of our foreclosed buildings that we deal with. So in fact, you can wait a decade and the building's just fine. It just happens to owe an enormous amount of property taxes.
And outside management can be problematic because boards and shareholders then forget that they have responsibilities. And then when the property taxes and the water and sewer have been paid, people are up in arms and they're like, we didn't know this was going on. And it's like, well, maybe you should have. And then they just expect that management,
Right.
was supposed to do everything. And it's like, just because you have a manager doesn't mean that you don't have a fiduciary responsibility to your building. So outside management it's just as complicated as being self-managed.
Right. But it has this tendency that people just go back in their apartment and close the door and say, oh, especially if it's going well, and
Right.
then you don't know if it's
Especially
not
when the
going.
heat is on and the
Right.
lights are on in the hallway.
Right. But being able to provide management at a scale, and services at a scale, and the economies of scale are something that a land trust in a neighborhood could get. Being able to provide that network amongst building leaders that are self-managed and providing some supports for self-managers, which is what we do, and we'd hate to see competition, but so we work something out. But anyways, I think that's something that could do. But that speaks to organizing the strong buildings in many ways. More than the weak buildings, and once you have a strong network of strong leaders, you may in fact have a force that can then deal with the buildings that are in trouble. The way that the buildings, HFCs that are in trouble, what they're saying they're in trouble for is not paying their water and sewer and their taxes. And sometimes that's symptomatic of a lot of other problems in the buildings, and sometimes that's symptomatic that they haven't paid their water and sewer and taxes, and they haven't raised their rents, their monthly charges, but they're doing okay. Their building's in pretty good shape, they're fine. What happens to them now is they go into third-party transfer. The city redoes the building at great expense, much of it unnecessary, and comes out with a building that's it has a high amount of debt, has much higher monthly charges, requires lots of Section 8 to make it affordable. And you've sort of lost, and they won't let them be a co-op again, so you've lost the engagement of the residents. So it's not, so there may be other ways to deal with what everybody keeps calling troubled HDFCs, and I think the troubled HDFCs need to be looked at. Is their trouble financial? Is their trouble the fact that HPD did a crappy rehab job the first time and they need another one? Is their trouble that they really have mismanaged and they really are in bad physical shape and they fight with each other, and they had a leader that was stealing, all those kinds of things can be part of it, and they're all different and they all get lumped together. But they also, from our experience, are the hardest buildings to put back together. They're not something that's easy to do. They may look like easy victims hanging out there and we can pick them up, but in fact, it's can be 5-10 years of work to redevelop a board, get their finances back in shape, go out and get them financed, get them rehab, go through all the processes to get them done. And and nobody pays for that. I don't know how we pay for it, but we manage to.
What are the incentives for the stronger HDFCs to enter in something like this, where they would be losing some piece of their future asset potential?
Well, I don't know whether they need to lose. I mean,
Okay.
you can have land trusts where you own buildings, but you also, can have affiliated buildings that are you can have a whole bunch of members who are not owned, whose land is not owned, but they may get management services, they may get other services, they may provide services, and they may have an interest in seeing the building down the street, the vacant lot down the street, things happening in their neighborhood, and being the supporters of. In the meantime, they provide a strong armature on which these could fit in, but it would seem to me that then you'd have it would be just sort of this idea that came from the outside that is trying to take hold, it's something that is owned by the local folks, and and then they can say what it is that they want. You know, there could be reasons to give up something if there was something to get back for it. You know, I think even with the buildings that are troubled, they're not gonna give up necessarily. You know, I think people fought very hard to get their buildings, and the last thing they're gonna do is necessarily give up their building to somebody else. They may, if it makes sense, they may. If they're still a co-op, but they give up their land and they get their taxes paid, or their taxes, whatever it is, but there'd have to be a real trade-off to do it. And, you know, and the building may do it in exchange for getting rid of their taxes, or they may do it for refinancing to get it, you know, 20 years out, they may need a whole
So,
rehab.
I'm sorry, excuse me. So we've been gathering a whole bunch of data, as Robin stated earlier, and we get like a snapshot image of what kind of taxes they owe, but we don't really have much insight into like the management team and things like that. So what would you consider as an appropriate threshold, if you will, for if it goes above this amount in taxes or this many years in taxes, we should then start to consider it because it might be a reflection of poor management? I don't know.
We always say 15,000 per unit means they're like,
There's
Screw.
no, well, but it also depends which years the taxes are too.
Yeah.
I mean, there's tax forgiveness programs but it stopped.
in 2001.
Yeah,
after
so
that.
anything before 2001, so if that's where their taxes were, then, but that's
Not that
where
big
they
of a
stay.
deal. Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
there's
where
not-
they stay, and if we can get that fixed and brought up to date, then then you have a new tool. But there's a certain point in which there's an amount at which they can't refinance them. If they've got to pay them and they've got to go get a loan for them, then there's a point at which it's just impossible to still be affordable if you're going out to a financial institution and borrowing the money to pay the taxes and the water and sewer. And so, yeah, it may be 15,000. We used to look at the buildings that were sort of under what it was approximately 1 year's of taxes, and they were just late and they were redeemable. And we'd have this middle ground where with some real work you could get yourself out, and then there's this upper level at which point, short of a lot of forgiveness and refinancing or something intervening, you're not getting out of this with the current financial tools. You might, I think it's on our website, the old tax study.
Yeah, I think that's on the website. That's from like 2010,
Might be, or it might be an earlier one. But
2008 or 2009.
we used to regularly go through all the buildings and analyze their taxes and water and sewer, and then put them together, and then do a report. And we would do those kinds of typologies about owing so much, and then there's the issues of strong management and not strong management. But I don't think there is necessarily a correlation directly between owing a lot of money and having good management or bad management. You know, it could be great management and very strategic thinking to say, forget the city, we're not paying them anything, we're taking care of business, and we're going to keep our families warm, we're going to keep our building in good shape, and you know, when the war comes, we'll fight that war. So it's really knowing the individual buildings, and it's sort of hard with the data that you get, which is just water and sewer and taxes.
Right.
And maybe you can get the violations. That's the data we now have on all HDFCs. But that's not necessarily going to tell you a whole lot.
And so for some buildings, going into a payment plan is an option, but and you know that's when you don't have to take on any kind of loan and financing. It's just, but that's really only an option like when their taxes are kind of in that mid-range, because it doesn't to a certain point the late payments and the interest are so high that it doesn't make sense to do that. You know, because you're paying your quarterly taxes, and then you're in this agreement where you're paying monthly on it, and you know, it's like
And 9%, it's,
yeah, 9% interest. It's,
Right.
so that really is only for, you know, like buildings if they get like a year behind, right? And we, you know, devise a financial strategy. That's an option where it's like, okay, and then you get into a payment plan with the DOF, and then, you know, this will be taken care of. But after that, it's really not an option.
right. Sometimes it's an interim option while you're working on then refinancing it. But at 9%, a 9% 32-month loan or whatever it is,
Mhm.
it's pretty onerous. The other thing is that the taxes and water and sewer penalty interest is 18% on some of it. So that if you look at buildings that have millions and millions of dollars in taxes, not much of it is the taxes. Most of it is interest, and
Yeah, oh,
penalties
yeah.
and stuff. And if you look at the 100 and something, 200 buildings that owe substantial amounts, there are probably a dozen or two that owe most of it. There are really a handful of buildings that just owe enormous amounts of money, most of which is interest. But they just have had these tax bills owing and accumulating and compounding at 18% for a long time. And so that while there's over $100 million owed by the HDFCs, or probably more than that now, it's a few that owe a lot. There's then this next chunk in that other part of the curve, and then most of them are just fine, and you don't hear about it. And so that's the other thing. The focus on troubled HDFCs makes, you know, it's 15% are troubled. So the last, where one of the past commissioners said, oh, a program with 15%, that's a failed program. And these, whereas we would say 100% of these buildings were failed rentals, because that's how they became city-owned. 100% of the private owners of these buildings were failed private ownership, and yet what they want to move them all back to is private ownership rental. And 100% of these buildings were failures in that category, so that the lowest income people with the least experience in managing buildings are able to have an 85% success rate is 85,000 times better than what private owners, managers, landlords, and slumlords and the city of New York had been able to do previously. So it's pretty outrageous to say that it's a failure. But on the other hand, this focus on the failed HDFCs makes it seem like the whole program has failed, when in fact there are 850 buildings, 900 buildings, 800 buildings doing just fine. There's 200 buildings that need some help. And so that's, and you know, in many ways we do it to ourselves, and the buildings do it to themselves. One of the things that's really nice about these buildings is when they have trouble, they speak up very often. They'll go ask for help. They'll talk to city council people, hear about them. They're the only ones our city council members hear about. They're the only ones the community organizations hear about, because they're asking for help. The rest of them are, you wouldn't even know they were there. They're doing just fine. They're running their buildings. Maybe they're selling them for $1 million, but that's a different issue. And that's clearly an issue that the land trust could actually help address.
Yeah.
It's the high sales prices, if you can get
What
some.
have you been seeing happen to the HDFCs?
Some of them are abusing the notion, but it's, you know, with the complicity of the city hasn't stepped up and says you can't do that. They haven't.
So what's happening?
We've continued for the last quarter of a century to try and get the city to put price caps on them, and we have a new administration. Maybe we'll do better this time.
Well, what are they selling for? Like they're just going straight to market? Is that it? Straight to market rate? Is that?
Yeah, occasionally you'll see.
Yeah, I mean the
Once-
buildings that are in, you know, Upper Manhattan, in like the Upper West Side.
What in the regulatory the existing regulatory agreement of an HDFC allows them to do that, or did not
Nothing.
allow them to do it. There was a gap though, like 20 years they have to stay low income.
No. They're HDFCs. The purpose of an HDFC is to provide housing for persons of low income. It's pretty clear to me that, you know, that should be 80% of median, but, you know, the city has said 120% of median, but whatever it is, that it's not just the income of people coming in. You'll see them in the Times and the ads, you know, apartment for sale, you know, $650,000, $1.2 million, whatever it is, and they'll say income restrictions apply. And therefore, they're looking for somebody with a low income, which would be 120% median usually, who happens to have $1.2 million to buy an 8-room apartment in Harlem. And that, you know, to me, that's not fulfilling the corporate purpose, the public trust. HDFCs have a public trust. They are trustees of a tax-funded special purpose corporation. And it doesn't seem to me that they're fulfilling that trust and that, but HPD hasn't chosen to regulate them.
And it's problematic because those buildings are receiving tax abatements. So, you know, ethically, it's like you are technically, you know, you have a status as an affordable housing entity and your taxes reflect that, yet you have, you know, $2 million in a savings account because you've been selling, because you feel like you can. But some buildings, I mean, most of the buildings I work with in the Lower East Side and Brooklyn have, you know, reverted to these sales because they feel like they had to, because their property taxes and their water and sewer got out of control. And then, you know, these neighborhoods like the Lower East Side or Williamsburg, where they know they can make these sales for $400,000 for a 1-bedroom. They do it because then they can put that money towards their
Right,
taxes.
and those are often ones that were rentals, somebody dies or leaves and the building owns it and the building uses it to fill gaps.
Exactly.
And HPD encourages this to happen.
They absolutely do.
And so you know, and they may encourage it at it's not market level, but at $250,000.
They're like, that's cheap.
Right, and you have 3 of those, you could pay for your whole renovation. But once you've done that, you've set the floor for the sales price.
And you begin to change. The problem we see too is the dynamic of the building changes because the majority of the residents there are of a totally different income bracket than new people coming in, and it's problematic for, you know, for the future.
It's this internal displacement that will take place when people who've paid market-like prices and then they want the stairwell fixed up or the lobby fixed or whatever. And the extra cost doesn't mean that much to them, but to the, you know, 25 seniors who are living in that building and just making it on their monthly charges to see they go up means they get displaced.
And that's one thing that we haven't started getting into detail about, but the only way that this would work, the only way that these buildings could support each other and that these lower rents could be subsidized is by renting out many of the vacant units at market prices. And so
I don't think that, well, one, you can't have a co-op like that.
Yeah, these buildings, the renters have to also be within the income limit.
Right, and you're not allowed to have renters. You only have the renters you have, and when they leave, you're supposed to sell the unit, but HPD doesn't necessarily enforce that. But I don't believe that cross-subsidizing, cross-subsidy is going to be a real problematic kind of thing. It's, you certainly can't have a co-op like that.
Because then that's just like exclusionary, inclusionary rather,
Right.
zoning.
Yeah, you could do inclusionary housing that way, where, you know, we have a co-op in a building, we have 13 units out of a 60.
Oh, Juniper, right?
Jupiter,
that's what it is.
Jupiter 21, out of a 65-unit building or something, where, you know, the existing residents who lived on the site before they built the building, bought their apartments for $10 and pay $500-600 a month for their studio or 1-bedroom, the new people moving into this luxury rental are paying, the cheapest studio is $36.50 a month. So it's a pretty big disparity, and the new people buying in might pay 100 and something thousand to buy their apartment in our little 13 units. And that, it might work, we don't know. I mean, it's not clear what the co-op has to do, because they're living spread out amongst this luxury rental. So everything's taken care of, they don't have a lot to meet about and to take care of. On the other hand, as far as we can tell, they're happy as can be, living there in their gorgeous building with their beautiful deck and outdoor living room and weight room and elevators and fancy appliances.
But Ken's
It's the most amazing. It's just wonderful. They're the happiest people I think.
Ken's proposal does offer a cross subsidy. It's not. I still think it's quite low, the rents that he's proposing in bringing new people into. But it does depend on some tenants paying more than others to help cross subsidy. Can you just return to what you perceive to be the challenges with cross subsidy?
Well, one is the basic principle of our co-ops and of almost all co-ops is everybody pays their fair share of the costs. So that, you know, based on your square footage or the number of rooms you have, you pay your share of the costs. And I think that having some people pay more than others and having some people be more equal than others will make it difficult to have a democratic, you know, mutual support co-op. I just think it's hard. Now, there are ways that you could build some things in to try to get some subsidies in there, but I think on the monthly charges, it's going to be, people see that. People, you know, if you look at the books, it's not a matter of talking. If people should be looking at the books, and people's name and their monthly charge should be right there, and everybody should be discussing it. And when you raise the budget, you know, do the budget, they should be looking at it, and it looks kind of odd. And it's going to make for some very difficult kinds of things. So.
Have you encountered that ever in buildings, different rents becoming problems, or you just eliminate that from all the buildings you manage?
I've not seen it, other than in something like this where the building has two uses.
The 80/20.
Right, in this particular case, which is new for us in this one, but they're sort of separate entities. They just are intermingled, and there's not a lot to do, and one subsidizes the other. But
Interesting.
if you're expecting everybody to work together, it seems to me that you have people paying more and less.
What is the tax situation you're looking at for this CLT you're having in Bushwick? Does it change the way that the co-op is taxed, the buildings are taxed, to have the interest?
No, Article 11's in these development programs get 100% tax abatement for 40 years. So, and that would be true in this case.
And that's co-op or
Any
or land trust?
HDFC can get, the city council has to give it to you, but that's part of, you know, the ANCP program, the TPT program, almost any development. The TIL program has a different dam tax cap, which is, they pay some tax.
And what happens after that 40 years?
Then you've got a
Trouble.
problem, but there's nothing that says they can't re-up them, and we're talking about, we have some, well, they're mostly J51s that have run out on buildings, and we get
A renewed.
a renewed tax cap. There was a suggestion made by one of our board members that we're trying to get new 40-year abatements for all the HDFC co-ops, full tax abatements. And one of the things one of my board members suggested is that they extend that law another year. Every January 1st is the first bill that they do when the new city council meets every January 1st. They just make it a habit of always making it out 40 years. So even if they miss a decade, it's still just keep going. 33,000 of them are co-ops. And that if they wanted to get the first, I don't know what it would be, 45% of their job done, they could pass a tax abatement, 100% tax abatement that these buildings could opt into, sign up for, that would preserve them as, over the long term, at least for 40 more years, if not more, as affordable, and there would be strict price controls on the co-ops and strict income guidelines for all of them, and other sorts of things that would help assure that they're better, that they, we don't get as many troubled ones. There would be more supports and more help. And that's an easy one. It doesn't really cost anything.
85,000 units. Wow.
Yeah, that's all in
A lot
one
of
day they
buildings.
could do that.
Oh my God. That's where that 100,000 of city-owned buildings went, eh?
Yeah.
It's in 82.
Well, the TIL program is the largest disposition they've done. I mean, there's probably 900 buildings, 1,000 buildings that came out of that.
Great. Yo, girls, y'all got more questions?
Just digesting.
Were you referring to, like, in East Harlem, with the CLT, having rentals maybe separate from the co-ops that would be market rate? Like a
Part of what Anne shared with us at our first meeting is the pro forma that I think you're referring to, and it's predicated on the fact that some units will be as low as 300 and some units will be as high as 1,300, and that's not necessarily in the same building, but it's part of the same land trust. So I think that's where
And
this
that,
scenario would differ from a co-op, because it's not necessarily in the same building, and I think one of the advantages of the CLT model as opposed to a co-op model is being able to draw from a much more
Correct.
diverse stock of buildings.
and the land lease gives you the ability to collect some of that excess and provide it to others. I mean, right, so I mean, yeah, it's spread out across buildings, and I'm not sure all of them were co-ops at all. Some of them are just rentals on top of the land, so, yes.
Exactly.
So land trust has that flexibility to provide a variety of housing types and
yeah, because what we're saying
cross-subsidize
is within one
building, you can't
Within
do
one
that.
building that's a co-op, right, that
You
would
can't
not.
do that.
Yeah.
But across, because
Yeah.
anything that we put together, we're talking about multiple sites. It would have to be multiple buildings that are coming together. Some very strong buildings that would be supporting the buildings that need some more
Right.
help. And we're looking at vacant properties for development, we're looking at commercial spaces, we're looking at different revenue generating ways of bundling sort of these things together to produce enough income to sustain the CLT.
And that's what, like, this Ridgewood Bushwick project is, like, first and foremost HDFC co-op that just so happens to be on a community land trust. It's
Right.
like, and that's, so there are,
No, it's all right.
well, so they are beholden to, their bylaws and the documents, and they all have that in common.
Right.
Which the buildings in the CLT will have that with their CLT
But not necessarily.
incorporation, but then each of them would have their own, which is kind of what Andy was saying initially, is why it's like complicated, because, you're meeting as a co-op, and then you're also on this land trust, so it's like, I think it's about what's the entity that is like keeping the land trust functioning, and, what is that gonna, is it like a management, is it a manager that is like the sponsor? Well, that's messy too, though, because that's like, who's checking on the manager, like, the spot, so it's, I don't know, there's lots of, I guess, ways to look at
But,
that.
right, and I think that there is still some caution, because if you get active land trust members, and some people are subsidizing other people, that you have to make sure that everybody is benefiting, that, that the units that are there, are, you're not just creating high market units at the top of the market, and because you might get people saying, well, if we got rid of these low income units, to sell those buildings, we could lower our monthly charges, we wouldn't have to subsidize,
Right.
that is but once it gets built in and everybody is winning in this one, everybody has an affordable apartment for their income, and it is not at the top of the market. I think that it's an education process that everybody feels, that they're getting something that's appropriate for them.
And
Yep, the other thing, I should step back because I just had this thought. The other way that this gets done, and it gets done in co-ops and it gets done very well, and actually people are very supportive of it, is in the Mitchell-Lama co-ops. They have surcharges for people with higher incomes, and that subsidizes the buildings. And so that's the method that, in fact, does work, and sometimes we think that should be made available more broadly across HDFCs and stuff so that you could do that. And that would be a way within a co-op to do that. But it also requires a level of sophistication that the land trust could provide, which in the small co-ops we don't have, which is to do annual income certifications. On the other hand, it's sort of, as I was just saying, if you look at the Mitchell-Lamas, even the people paying full surcharged monthly charges are paying ridiculously low monthly charges. Even the full surcharge is nothing compared to, what the rents would be in a building nearby.
How strenuous are those processes on tenants to have to go through yearly, like an annual?
They just have to provide their income tax statements to
So it's not
to
something
management.
that really scares people away.
Well, they're used to it. They had to do it to get in, and they did do it every year since, and they get a big benefit from it. And if they don't, then they pay the high. They
'Cause
pay
they
the
can.
surcharge. Right. So that
Interesting.
they don't, somebody with a very high income could just say, charge me the surcharge. So they don't have to disclose their income. No one has to know.
They
also, Mitchell-Lamas have a lot of nice quirks that they're designed in large part for city and state workers and retirees. Your pension doesn't count as income, so that all of your government pension, so all the city and state workers who are on pensions
are fine.
have no income, very little income. And so
Cozy retirement.
right, so that it really, it's really, but that's sort of everybody wins. And so nobody's gonna complain because even with the highest paying surcharge, it's very affordable. So.
Have you guys been informed at all by the experience of Cooper Square in the imagination of your project?
We do the training for Cooper Square. We train their cause. We certainly have been, talking to them and been, aware of what's been going on and stuff since the very beginning. So somewhat, and the Attorney General did the same thing to them that they did to us. In terms of their demand, it sort of comes out of the same place. So that's why they have this. They have this two. They have their different parts. They seem to be in different parts, and I think they've had some issues about everybody getting along with each other and figuring out who does what. And I think that's one of the things that you need to be clear about.
And you mentioned that the project in Ridgewood, Bushwick, is mostly financed by HUD grants, is that what you said?
It's all HUD grants.
It's all HUD
Well,
grants.
and some state home ownership grants.
Some student grants, okay.
So there's no debt, or at least at this point, there's no debt.
And then how are you going to, excuse me, how are you gonna cover the operating costs and your costs? Is that covered by the grants as well, or is there a sort of a long-term strategy for,
Well, people pay their monthly charges.
and that's what covers all the operating costs?
Yeah, and without debt, it's not very much. And I think anybody who needed it applied for Section 8,
Okay.
Which is not available.
not available
Anymore.
any longer.
Yeah. Wow.
Sequestered.
Which, that's like another issue that we really face with the buildings is when the economy goes bad, you know, you really see it reflected in these buildings, because not only do people get laid off, but, you know, Section 8 then becomes not an option. And it's like you're talking about increasing maintenance, and people are like, well, you know, I can't do that. So then even when you kind of how Andy was talking about people who are like, well, if we could just get rid of those people and get new people in, we'd be fine. So it's really challenging thinking about like some of these buildings moving forward, and that's why the idea of like 100% tax abatement becomes important, because if we could cut that cost, then they would be able to pay their oil, which is like insane, and do other necessary capital improvements to the building, have a reserve account, like these things that become less and less accessible. So yeah, I mean, Section 8 not being available, and there's no rent subsidies for these buildings. So that's like,
And it's, you know, in my memory, since Section 8 vouchers were around since Nixon, this is the first time where it's really, I mean, Section 8 often became more available when the economy wasn't there, you know, and at least it got redeployed so as to, here, it just, you know, I mean, it's just, it's a different world when you have Congress sitting there unable to, you know, extend unemployment benefits and sequester Section 8. I mean, it's just, you know, goes along with Ukraine and all the rest of the world just sort of falling apart. You just begin to wonder what's going on in Washington. So.
Wow. I don't have any more questions. Do you guys? Are you guys good? How do you feel?
I think I have one more question. I'm not sure if it wasn't already answered. But I think one of the things that we're trying to also figure out is the parameters in which we decide certain buildings, so whether it's like a geographic decision or if there's like some other indicator that we use to decide which buildings to have in these like packages or like clustered deals.
You mean when you put them together for development?
Right.
I think it's a development kind of question. I mean, it's more, you know, are they all going to be taken in the same round of third-party transfer, or are they, you know, I mean, I'm not sure you get a lot of control over that, but, you know, a bunch of them will come up in the same third-party transfer round if that's where some of these buildings are going to come from. Or you may be able to, if the city actually starts doing those kinds of things again, would actually put together a package of city-owned property or whatever. They can, in some ways, they can sometimes create a particular package, and it's their doing because they all fall within a certain geographic code, tax code, or I mean, tracts or whatever, and so that it may. I'm not sure that it you know, there's a scale depending upon the financing you're going to use. I think it's more. I don't think there's any, you know, formula for it. I mean, our clusters we got just happened to be what was available. You know, we have our 203Ks in Manhattan. It's a bunch of these little buildings in East Harlem and into West Harlem, and they just happened to be the ones that were caught up in the scandal that signed up for you know, to be co-ops. So.
Interesting. Oh, the city-owned, the ones that remain city-owned currently are mostly like A and CP, and they're ones that I guess we're going through too, but are no longer, or newer ones that came in as well exist in those packages
There's no
generally.
newer buildings. Nothing's come in until in a decade or more. I don't know how long.
But HPD gets buildings from time to time too, right?
No.
Privately, no, not anymore.
ANCP is just the next step phase until.
It is Till.
Yeah.
They just renamed it. It's the Till. Originally it was the buildings that were going into development in Till, but now they seem to have renamed everything ANCP. It's and next week they could change the name. So
So none all those buildings are a legacy from decades ago. There's no new buildings that have come into city ownership that will ever go into this kind of
There are
format
no
again.
new buildings coming into city ownership through tax foreclosure.
Because the city doesn't have a policy of that currently. Interesting. Great. Thank you
Thank you.
so much for
It's
sharing.
amazing.
Yeah.
Again, just to make clear, is it okay if I share what you said with the Nicely people? Great.
I don't think I said anything bad.
I'll take anything bad you say.
No, I'll-
That time when you started ranting about.
I'll hear from them.
And I guess if we have any questions further down the line, would it be okay for us to reach back out to you?
And you do a presentation at the end of this?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Ooh.
I've been to some of them. You know, the other thing, previous groups have done projects for us, and one of the things that they did for us is they created a simple template for figuring out the development costs for buildings. You know, when you're looking at a building, figuring out how much it would cost to fix it up and stuff like that, which we use when we go out and look at, you know, privately owned buildings in foreclosure and stuff. But you might see if you can find somebody in the lab must, you know, somebody must keep the other projects, it must be around. It might, I don't know if it's helpful. I mean, Ken did a whole bunch of pro formas I remember seeing, and his stuff is sort of there, but this is sort of just a little bit simpler, but.
Yeah, we'll talk to Kevin and see if we could track that down. That would be helpful.
Do you know Kevin McQueen?
I don't think so.
He's your professor, right?
Yeah.
For this
Yeah,
class.
it's great.
Yeah.
So, and I guess we'll also invite you guys to the presentation when we do it. If you
Yeah,
have
that'd
time,
be
come
fun.
by.
Yeah.
I enjoyed them in the past.
Yeah? Are they useful for you guys?
Sometimes, some of them have been, this one is particularly, they still use it over, I mean, I don't know if it's remained absolutely the same, but our organizers still use that one. We did another one, it was helpful sort of at that moment. It didn't have a lot of
Longevity?
longevity because it was asking just very particular questions, but
Mhm.
I'm trying to remember. I think those are the two main ones that I think we may have done one or two others over the years. And I just can't remember what they are.
Cool. Well, thanks so much again.
Yeah, thanks for taking the time. This has been extraordinarily helpful. Yes,
And
absolutely.
You didn't want to sit down?
I don't know, she's so busy
She's
these
too
days.
busy.
She's just going crazy and everything. I had lunch with whoever it was, the director, or the whatever from Habitat, who's coming to New York with the dean in the dean's office, and you know, we said, oh great, you know, and they went down to HPD, and HPD loved it, and they gave them their first building and everything, and it was, you know, you first time out, you get a great reception, and then you get treated like shit by everybody else. And you know, you just join the club, but so it's great to have new ideas because something gets done, and then you have an ally who's, you know, been through a successful project, and now they can join the club, and we can all struggle together. It's good. So I really think, but I also think that if you get a group of strong building leaders and community people, and they get together, particularly, and the folks from sort of the outside sort of can step back a little bit, it's a pretty powerful political thing. And if they say this is what we want in our neighborhood, it's going to be pretty compelling, especially with this administration. So I think the people part and people in the neighborhood taking ownership of it, I think it, you know, something could come of it, and it may not be a lot of development. It may be support of existing housing, or it may be helping struggling buildings, or it may find the private owners who are struggling, and you know, they may discover other avenues. But I think it needs to have, you know, that strength that it'll get from somewhere.
Right.